So my plan is to kind of follow along and do some of the same stuff that we're going to want to do as you're doing for the lab assignment. So if we look at that lab assignment here, remember I've broken it into 3 pieces. Show the available consoles, filter by that console, or show your personal lists. Now, with that, I don't really have necessarily a direct equivalent to consoles over here. Consoles would make sense with movies, so instead I'm going to do genres. Because a movie can be part of multiple genres, and so I can kind of set it up the same way. You'll see this set up in a bunch of different places. Okay, so I'm going to do this with genres. Now, you'll remember that I previously had already set up one part of this, so I already know from my movies, I know which genres they're part of. You see that? So I'm already just like, hey, this one's action, romance action, and then this one says it's comedy action, right? So you remember that I kind of set up that process early in a previous setup. I do want to look at real quickly how I did that because it's important for how you want to set up the console availability. So if I jump into the Firebase console, I want to look at how my data is structured first. So I'm going to go into the movie list. I'm going to go to my Firestore database, and I go to movies. Okay. So if you look at this movie, look at how on the database side I'm storing the genre. So I've got a genre field. It's a type. It's map, and within that map, I have a single key called action, which is true. Does everybody see that? Okay. Also, if I look at some of the other movies, same kind of idea here. I've got genre, which is a map, which contains the action and the romance key, both of which are true. Okay. So everybody tracking with me there so far? So that's how I'm tracking what genres the movie's part of. So it'd be the same idea where you'd say, hey, this game is available on Xbox. This game is available on PlayStation, PS4, PS5, whatever. So it'd be the same kind of structure. Okay, we're going to use a map where it's string to true. Okay. Now, what I want to do in terms of the database setup, which I haven't done yet, is remember when I asked you to set up the database, I asked you to create a collection for consoles. Does everybody remember that? I asked you to create a collection for consoles. I want to do the similar setup here, where I'm going to add a collection for genres. Okay? So I'm going to add a new collection and call this genres. And then within there, I need to create some documents. So for instance, I might create action and maybe give that a name. And that name would be action. So I'm kind of using the ID as being lowercase, as being something that maybe the user doesn't see, versus the name is the thing that is going to be user visible. I might also want to have in there some sort of icon or logo that I'm going to use to display that category. Now I need to go get those icons, and I'll do that in a second. But first I'm going to add these different documents. So all I'm going to put in here is a name and an icon. So action, I've got romance, which name, romance, icon, leave that blank for the minute, and then I'm going to add in comedy, name, comedy, and icon there. So I've got 3 different ones, 3 different genres that have a name, and they have a placeholder for an icon, which I'll add here. Okay. Now, you might ask, why am I doing this? Why am I creating this collection? There are a few reasons why I want to do this. Okay. One, it gives me a place in the database that I can query. right? So I'm going to use this table to populate one of my dropdowns, okay? The other thing that lets me do is lets me put metadata about the different genres or the different consoles in one place. So for instance, if I have an icon for those genres, then I only have one place to update it. I don't have to go update all of the movies if I decide to change that icon. Does that make sense to everybody? Or same way with your consoles, I don't have to go a bunch of places and change the icon that I'm using for that console. I just have one collection to do it. Okay, so that's part of why I'm doing this. It makes it easier to manage it. Okay. All right. So now that I have that, I need to go find some icons. And the place that I found icons before has been to jump into flat icon. If you look at the lab assignment, I did go ahead and find one here that's created by FreePick. So they do have one that has a bunch of icons. You probably can pull a good number of your logos there, but you may need to look through. You may need to look as well through flat icon, because I didn't specifically find a say Windows or a PC icon on this list, but it does have a bunch, so that can be as a good starting point. So for me, I might want to look for action. See if we can find a good logo for action. That works. So let's take that. So I'm gonna share that if I can. There's my action logo that I'm going to download. I need romance, and so maybe I use this icon, and I'll add beep. There's that one, and download it. And I also need an icon for comedy. Although I've got a little bit of a problem now that I think about it. So, because what I want actually to be there is URLs. So maybe I may need to do a little bit more digging. Let me go ahead and download those images. Okay. So it's entirely possible that I could add these to my project. I could pull all three of these down, add them to my project. Okay. I've got two problems if I add this to the project. Okay. One, first of all, if I have to add all the icons to the project, then it doesn't enable me to later on really add things to the database that aren't already in the app, right? Because the icon kind of has to be in the application already. Does that make sense to everybody? So if I download them and put them in the app, well then I can't easily say, hey, we're gonna just add more genres to the database, and they'll magically just work in the application. Okay. On the flip side, the user doesn't have to download these from the internet after they've downloaded the app, because they'd just be shipped with the app. So there is a little bit of a trade-off there, right? So, and if I'm going to work with, if the other gotcha is, how do I, if I put them into the project, if I download them and put them into the project, how do I identify them in the database? Okay, how would I identify them in the database if they're part of the project? Well, that means they don't have a URL. If they're part of the project, they don't have a URL to access them by. So what do we do? How are resources identified in Android? How do resources identified if you're going to try and use them in code? Do you remember?
With R.
With R, what data type are they? So like if I say, remember once I bring the image into the code base, let's say I do it as, I could type in r.drawable dot like comedy, right? If I called it comedy.png, it would show up as r drawable comedy, okay? But what data type is that? R drawable comedy is what data type?
I'm guessing it's not just the data type of the file itself.
Correct. It's not an image, it's not a drawable. What is that specific thing in code? Remember, anytime you have a resource, this is just the ID of the resource. So that right there, all drawable comedy, is actually an integer. It's actually an integer. Okay? So maybe I toss that integer into the database as the ID of the icon. The gotcha there is these IDs for the resources are not stable, and you shouldn't rely on them being stable. Because what happens is every time you do a build, it chooses those numbers. It's not guaranteed from one version of your app to the next version of your app to have the comedy icon have the same ID. Everybody tracking with me there? Okay, it's not guaranteed. If I push a new update, it may change. Part of that's based on, in some ways, we want to kind of treat it as effectively random, but it can be affected by things like, oh, I added more icons, so therefore the IDs are different, etc. Okay, so that's how we identify it in code, is with an ID, but I cannot put that integer into the database because it's not stable. Does that make sense? Okay, so what can I put into the database? I could put a URL, but remember, if they're in the project, I don't have a URL, right? If they're in the project, I could put something like comedy, right? I could put the string comedy, and then I'd have to somehow work it back in the code to say, oh, if it's the string comedy, then use this resource. Okay, so that's one way we can do this. We can say, okay, we're going to ship all the icons with the application. What we're going to put in here is a string kind of naming the icon, and then I have to use a switch statement in code to actually turn it into the icon itself. Okay, so that's one way you can do this, right? You can say, hey, we'll put a string in the database, and we'll switch it, we'll use it in code. That's a give or take, right? Versus, obviously, if we put it in there with the URL, we can just load it up with Picasso, okay? So I'm going to assume that at this point you guys know how to load it up with Picasso. So I'm going to take the harder approach, obviously, which is to put it as just the name and do the switch statement trick, okay? But I'm absolutely okay if you guys find URLs for your icons, for your console icons. I have no problem with you using URLs here. But I do want to show what happens if you want to embed or ship these icons with the application. Okay? So what I'm going to put for all of those is kind of just their ID. So I'm going to say this is comedy as the icon. This is going to be action. And this will be romance. Now, if you're using my example project, you should already be linked into the same database, so you shouldn't have anything to do there. But that is how I'm setting up the database side. Okay, so I've got an icon and a name that represents a genre. So I'm going to come back to the code, and I'm going to create a data class for that document that we just added. There's that collection that we just added. So under data, I'm going to say new Java class. I'm going to call this the genre. And we're going to kind of model it as we did before. So under here, we've got public string ID, public string name, and public string icon. So that's going to represent a genre for me. Remember, to the ID bit, I need to add the annotation document ID with an uppercase D, document ID. So that will model a genre document. Okay, it just has an ID, a name, and an icon. Cool. Good with that? So before I get into the spinners so much, I want to talk about how can I want to get to the point where I can show those icons in place of the text strings that I did before. Okay? So we can see those parts. All right. So to the drawable folder, I need to add those icons I had downloaded previously. So I'm going to go to my downloads, and I'm just going to start dragging these things in. So here I've got theater. I'm going to drag that into Drawable. And I want to call this, I want to make sure it goes to the Drawable folder, which I'm kind of unclear why it keeps going to Drawable 24, but that is what it was doing for me. So Drawable 24, or just Drawable, add, and I want to drag in hearts. Add, and drag in people, there it goes. Make sure it goes to just Drawable. Cool. All right, so I've got hearts, people, and theater. Now, remember that I maybe had those as different names on the back end, and I might want to go ahead and change that. So I'm going to go ahead and rename all three of those icons. So rename this one to romance from hearts. I'm going to rename this one to comedy. And I will rename this one to action. Okay. So I've done a quick rename there. I could also follow maybe I should follow my convention, because I think I did the convention the other time of starting those with IC. So maybe I should call those IC action, IC comedy, and an IC romance if I'm following my convention. But you can do it, you can really, what you name it is not that important. But let me follow the convention that I already set up. Okay, so I've got those three icons in. I'm going to need some sort of way to have those in the UI. So maybe I go to my item movie, and I make myself a place to put those into my layout. Now, reminder, we talked about this last time. Remember that there is image buttons and there are image views. So everybody remember what the difference was. What's the difference between an image button and an image view?
The image button has background, has a built-in transition darkening thing.
Okay. True, but not the difference you want to remember. Okay. Image buttons are interactable. Image views are not. That's the part you want to remember. Is because it's from the accessibility standpoint that you want to remember, not from the way it looks. Because the way it looks, you can change. The difference is how does it function. Okay. So if we're talking about adding these icons for the genres, are these things that should be interactable or not? Is the user going to interact with these icons, or are they not going to interact with these icons? So you're shaking your head. How so?
I'm not going to click on anything.
They're not going to click on anything. Okay. If they were going to click on them, then I would want to put these in as image buttons. But since the user is not going to click on them, I'm going to put them in as image views. Now, this is a good question for debate because you might have a reason for the user to click on them. So for instance, one reason you might want to do is you might want to say, hey, clicking on the icon adds it to, say, my library, right? Because you could implement the UI in a way where you say, hey, if the user clicks on the Xbox icon, then the Xbox version of the game gets added to my library. It could be helpful to do that. The gotcha then is if I just click on the icon, how do I know whether it needs to be added to the library or the wish list? Does everybody see that? Okay. Well, how do I solve that then? I could potentially say, hey, there's this is on 3 different consoles. So we'll have 3 buttons for your library and 3 buttons for your wish list. I could do that interface. It would take up a lot of space. Does that make sense? But you could do that. The other side of things is I could just say, let's just stick with 3, but then I kind of need to ask the user another question, wish list or library. So I need to answer that somehow in maybe a pop-up or a dialogue, right? So if we're going to make these interactable, we would likely need to also add a dialogue. Versus if we do just the wish list and library buttons. For now, it works. I do want to, at some point, add the ability to say, hey, I'm going to add this to my library for a particular, and at that point, ask them what platform they want it on. At that point, I will need a dialogue. So there is some question there. There are some reasons why you may want that to be a button. Or the other thing you could do is you could say, hey, I click on Xbox, and now it just shows me all the Xbox games, right? So there are a bunch of different interface variants where that might make sense for it to be an image button, depending on where you go, right? But for now, I'm going to assume that the user is not going to interact with it and make it an image view. Is that very clear with me? But it's something that is worth considering. It's worth considering that depending on what you want to do with it, it might be a button or just an image view. Okay. So I've got the movie genre field in here already, this text view, but because I'm going to change how they're being represented, I'm going to go ahead and take that text view out. So I'm going to remove that text view that's in there right now. If I look at the blueprint view, now that's interesting. This should be, I need to anchor these things up to the top now because they weren't anchored to anything. And maybe because I think maybe, let me undo that a second so we can talk about it. So I have actually a fork in the road here. So in terms of where I put the genre icons, I can put them in a few different places, right? I put these thumbs up and thumbs down button down here. I could potentially put maybe the genres above the thumbs up and thumbs down, or I could put it below. Any thoughts about where it would look better? Votes? Maybe on the bottom? Yeah, probably. Because especially if I put it down on the bottom, then I can maybe put it underneath where the image is. So it really depends on how your layout's going, where to put it in. So I'm going to go ahead and anchor these up here, and then start adding image views underneath. So image view, this is going to be action. I need to shrink this down. You can see the icon's coming in very large because that's because I started with 512 by 512 images. So I maybe need to push this down to, say, well, it's not going to be interactable, so I don't need to have it all the way up at 50 by 50. So maybe 20 by 20, 20 dp by 20 dp. Make it pretty small. So let me zoom in a little bit. I'm going to anchor that underneath the picture and to the left. I'm going to add another one here for comedy. Go to 20 dp by 20 dp. Anchor that here and there. Top to image, maybe image bottom. And copy that. Put that in here. Oh, that constraint is not where I want it to be. Boop, boop. This one, though, needs to be the other icon. So I need there. Okay. So I quickly added those three to the bottom. I need a little bit of spacing around these. So all three of these are 20 by 20. I need some spacing, maybe left and right, left and top. So maybe 8 and 8 on both sides there. 8, 8. Just to start breaking those things out. They're still kind of, you can see that they're still appearing right up to the edge of the card. Does everybody see that? So I might want to push them out a little bit. So in order to push them from the bottom of the card, I'm actually going to add a constraint to the bottom. That did not do what I wanted it to do. It's going to drag the constraint down and give that a margin of 8. And so you saw what happened as soon as I added that constraint. It pushed the bottom of the card down. So now it's got both a bottom constraint and a top constraint. And I want to do that for all three of these. The reason I want to do it for all three and not just the first one is that way if I need to show and hide different ones, I'm not depending on the first one being visible per se. Otherwise, if I only put the margin on one, then I'm depending on that first one always being visible to get the margins. Cool? All right, so that's my first bit of layout setup. Things I still need to do. Remember, I've still named these image view, image view 2, image view 3, so I do need to give those some names. So maybe I go through here and let's say item, movie, genre 1, item, movie, genre 2, item, movie, genre 3. Okay. Now, it's worth asking here in terms of the IDs. There's really two options. We could number these, which I've done, as 1, 2, 3, or I could also call these like item, movie, genre, action, item, movie, genre, comedy, item, movie, genre, romance. I could have done this either way. Okay. Either of those will get you to a working solution. Okay. If I hard code in, however, the names of the genres, that means I have to know all the genre names ahead of time. So everybody tracking with me there? If I hard code in the names here in the layout, I have to know all of them that will ever be in here when I'm coding this in. If I hard code in the numbers 1, 2, 3, I don't have to know the genres ahead of time. All I have to know is that they'll never be more than 3. Does that make sense? So I can say that there's a hard limit of, okay, there's only the most it can be on X number of genres, X number of platforms, but I'm not saying what those are. Does that make sense? So that's the reason that I would go down here and do it numbered, is simply from the purpose of that. Now, I could, if I wanted to be really fancy and I wanted to allow an unlimited number of genres, then I might set up a recycler view here, right? If I wanted to be really fancy and say, okay, well, we'll just take it as an array, we'll render a recycler view, and that will do it. But I want to keep this short. Okay, cool. Does that setup make sense so far? Let's go ahead and try to run it real quick and see where we're at. So if I try to run the application now, more than likely I'm going to get an error. Because remember, I got rid of the text view that I was previously using to render the genres. So right here, in the same place with that? Okay. So where I need to start in order to get it back up and running is I need to go into the view holder, and I need to modify that view holder. So the view holder right now is referring to this genre text view, which doesn't exist anymore. Does that make sense for everybody? Everybody see that? Okay. So I'm not going to have that there. I'm going to get rid of that genre text view. I'm going to comment it out. Okay. What I need to add in its place is a set of image views. So image view array genres. Or I could say genre icons. Okay. I'm going to do something a little bit different here that I haven't done before. This is intentional, but notice that I'm using an array here rather than separate. Okay. Again, I could set that there's a bunch of different ways to set this up. So I could have said genre 1, genre 2, genre 3, and I don't necessarily have to use an array here, but it does make some things easier. Okay. Having an array here does make some things easier. Okay. We'll look at here in a second how I'll show you how I populate it. But does that part make sense so far? Kind of just saying, hey, we've got multiple things. Okay. Back to the adapter now. So in the adapter, remember previously I had hooked this up to get item movie genre, right? And that was the text view. So it's no longer going to be that. So I'm going to comment that line of code out. What instead we want to do is we want to have that vh.genre, and this is an onCreate view holder, genre icons is going to be equal to a new image view array, right? And so specifically that length, the array is going to be size 3 because I put 3 icons into my land, right? If I had a different number of icons, if I could say, okay, well, it's up to 5 different consoles, well, then obviously that number would be 5. Good so far? Okay, I'm actually going to show you 2 ways to set this up. So one way is I hard coded in this way as 3, and then I will go down vh.genre icons 0 and say item view dot find view by ID or to ID dot item movie. Where's my genre? Item, there it is, genre 1. So genre 1 goes into slot 0 because arrays are base 0. So I do 0, 1, 2, and 1, 2, 3 on the IDs. Okay, so they started as individual elements on the Y, but at this point now I have them as an array of these. Simple as that, right? That much make sense? So anytime you have this situation where you have a bunch of text views, you have a bunch of image views, you have a bunch of things that like this, you'd like it to get into an array, that's really all you have to do. Is you just say, hey, let's make an array, and then populate it with those various IDs. And from there on out, you can treat it as an array. The other syntax I can do, I can use to set this array up is as follows. Genre icons equals new image view and a comma there. So this is what we call an initializer list. Right? So here I'm kind of doing it the long form way. This right here is a shorthand for the thing right above it, right? Where I'm just saying, okay, let's create the array and populate it at the same time. Okay, so again, both of these have the same result. Those both have the same output. So either of those ways work. I generally find it's more convenient for me to do the latter, okay? Because here I really have to know all of the IDs ahead of time. So this makes more sense to me to do it this way. If I needed to do this with a loop, if I had some way to do this with a loop, then I would have chosen this approach. Because that first approach you can do with a loop, this you can't use a loop with. But it's a lot shorter in cases like this where a loop doesn't really make sense or isn't even possible. Because I can't loop over the IDs. Does that make sense? There's no way for me to loop over. I don't want the three resource IDs without first getting those into an array. Okay, cool. So either of those ways are okay. You can do it either way. I'm going to do the second one because it's shorter. Okay. So the icons are now there. So that's in onBind. So remember, onBind, we're connecting the image views with the view holder. We're just going ahead and finding. Okay. That's all of the logic we want to do in onBind. Over in the onCreate is where we're going to do the other half of that logic. Okay. So in here, I previously in onCreate, I already have set up some logic. Okay. But that logic is now going to have to change. Okay. So previously here, I've got this if statement. I'm saying if the genre is null, then just clear out the text view. Otherwise, we're looping through and we're doing some logic with those image views. Everybody see that? Okay. Well, that logic is not going to make sense for the way things are now. Okay. So what do I need to do instead? I'm going to comment out both of those two parts. So this part as well as this one. Okay. And let's look at first what we need to do with the case of if the genre is null. Okay. So I need to loop somehow. And because specifically I need to loop over all of the image views, and basically I want to make them go away. Right? If this movie is not part of any genres or we don't know the genres, then we want to basically hide all of those image views. So I'm going to have a loop. I'm going to do just a classic for loop here. So int I is 0. I is less than vh dot genre icons dot length and plus I. So loop through all of the icons, all the image views one by one. And so for each of those image views, so let's say like that, we need to do two things. I want to set the image resource to 0. Okay. That way, whatever image it was using previously, it will clear that out. 0 is not a valid ID, so it will say, okay, there's no image I'm going to show. Okay. The other thing I want to do is make them invisible. So I'm going to say set their image to 0, as well as setting their visibility to view dot gone. Okay. So that's what I'm going to do in the first case. In the first case, I'm going to say, okay, we are going to just loop through all the icons, get rid of their icon, get rid of their image, and make them gone. Okay. Next piece. What do I do if I do have icons? What do I do if I do have icons? So I want to kind of loop through the, I've got two loops that I kind of need to do, right? So on one side, I need to loop through the genres that are set in the map. On the other side, I also need to loop through the image views themselves. Okay, so I've got kind of two loops that need to happen almost simultaneously. Okay, because they need to happen simultaneously, they're not really a good candidate for, say, doing a nested loop. Does that make sense? Let's say let's say I have 3 image views and 3 genres that's part of. Well, that would be 9 iterations. Well, that doesn't really work for me. Okay. So are we clear with that? So I want to kind of do both of those loops at the same time. Is everybody clear with that? So I'm simultaneously working through the image views, and I'm also working through the genres, right? So I have basically an index into both. I have an index into what icon are we updating, and an index into what genre we're looking at. Okay. Now notice when I set this up the other day, I was doing a for each loop here through the entries in that map. Okay. I don't have an index there. I can't have an index there. So when you're doing a for each, you don't get an index. Okay. Because it's a map, I can't refer to what's the 0th item, the 1th item, the 2nd, the 3rd. That doesn't exist. There's not really an inherent order to a map. Okay, so that means that I have to kind of do something a little bit different on that side, right? In fact, I'm kind of forced into using a for each loop because of that map. So everybody on track with that? Make sense? Okay. So that means that the loop that I had before is going to be very similar, the one that I reintroduce. So I'm going to still be looping over the entry set. I'm still going to be looping over those entries. And I still need to check if, within that loop, I still need to check if it's true. Because I only want to do anything if it says, okay, yes, true, it's in that genre. Because if it's false or null, then we're just going to treat it as, oh, it's not part of that genre. Okay. So this kind of gets me a loop where I'm looping over the genres that it is part of. Okay. So next question. Okay. Let's say in there, I found out here's the first genre that it's part of. So let's say I say vh.genre icons, and I'm going to say maybe 0 dot set image resource, and let me for the moment hard code that in as r.drawable dot IC action. So we'll say we use the action icon there. And I need to also set its visibility to visible. U.visible. Okay. Obviously, there's some more iteration that we need to do, but let's start with this as a starting point. So if I go through and I run the project right now, okay, we're going to see, first of all, looks actually like all of the icons are visible all the time. That's kind of interesting. Any thoughts why that is? Well, here's a hint, okay? Let me try to set, rather than setting its icon to action, let's say we set it to romance. So that first icon is being set, but it looks like it's always being set. So notice we're not actually getting into this case. That first part of the if statement actually is never getting triggered. Any thoughts why that is? This first part, right?
Because none of them are, they all have at least one done.
All of them have at least one image. Yeah. Here I only updated image 1. So why are what's happening with the image 2 and 3? Why is there an icon there?
They're hard coded.
They're hard coded where?
The designer XML.
Designer. Okay. So it's kind of a dangerous thing to be setting those icons in the designer, because oftentimes you end up things like this and like, oh, I overlooked something. Okay. So I might want to go back. I might want to go back to the designer and clean it up a little bit. And the fix there is pretty simple. In the designer, you notice I set source compat, but I set the source compat without the little wrench next to it. So if I take these icons out of the first one and put them into the wrench, that means they'll be in the designer and not when the application runs. So I'm going to do that with all 3 of these. Move it out, move it into the tool, move it out of here, move it into tools. Okay. So if I try to run the program now, because I switched those things in the designer, the other ones don't start out as being set. Cool? Okay. The other thing I could do is, just to make sure things are working and clean, the other thing I could do is maybe set them to a different, some sort of placeholder, just to verify that I didn't accidentally forget to set them. So what I might do is, on all 3 of those, for that first property that is going to appear when the application runs, I might want to pick one of the other icons I have. So for instance, I might want to say, okay, well, let's set all of those to the downloading icon, right, for instance. So maybe I start them out as downloading. And so if I run that program, that way if I see the downloading icon, I know that I've done something wrong. Does that make sense? If I use another icon there that's not a valid genres icon, that does help me verify that the code is working correctly. Okay. Cool? Okay. So I would recommend doing that when you're setting things up. I would recommend using a placeholder icon that doesn't look like the finished thing. Okay. So let's think about what we need to do to fix that. Okay. If I've got these icons, right, I need to set all of the remaining icons back to 0. Okay. How can I do that? How can I set all of the remaining ones to 0? Yes.
Can we just consider null as the base case and only set them to visible and their appropriate image whenever we find it?
So that's a good question, right? So what do you mean by the base case? Because what you're saying is right, but what do you mean by it for everybody's kind of information?
I mean, instead of wrapping the code for what to send in an if statement, if genre equals null, just always have it run in the on bind.
Okay.
Just write the line explicitly outside of an if genre equals null.
So you're saying take this out of the if statement, right? So I kind of say, okay, well, let's pull this out, and then I'll say if it doesn't equal null. Okay, that's one way to solve it, right? Yeah, we can go ahead and even try that and verify that that does work. Okay, that's perfectly valid. Okay, it does mean that for some of these icons, I may be setting it twice, where I might set it to 0 and then immediately set it to an image. It's just not necessarily a bad thing. Okay, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But it does mean that for some of these, the icons that do end up getting set, I'm setting them twice. Okay, so it's a perfectly valid candidate. You can solve the problem that way. I'm going to try and give you another solution, which is a little bit more advanced. Reason being, I want to kind of show how you can enhance this. Okay, so one thing I could do is, let's say I know that there's one icon that was displayed. If I just add that same loop afterward, so I loop through and show the icons, and do a second loop that starts at 1 instead of 0, right, that would set all the remaining ones. Does that make sense? Following that pathway? I'll clean up my dead code here. So I loop through here, I set one icon, and then I loop the second loop, and I set another icon. I set all the remaining ones back to invisible. That works as well. Okay? You're starting to kind of see the pattern there, right? So I'm actually going to have two loops followed by each other, right? The first one's going to kind of loop through the genres, and then when we get done, we'll kind of finish up and clear out the ones that we didn't set. Okay. So some things I need to do. I want to make sure that the icon actually is reflecting the actual genre in the database. Right now, I'm always setting it to one particular icon. So I do want to put some sort of if statement or switch to switch it based on the icon that's the genre that's there. Okay? Are you clear with that? Okay. So rather than directly saying, hey, let's set it to romance, I want to introduce some sort of switch statement. So maybe we say switch, and we switch based on entry dot get key, which would be the ID of the genre. And so I can put in some cases. So I could say, for instance, well, if the genre is action, lowercase action, then I can say, okay, well, let's set the icon to IC action. If it looks like I have an error in my code, it is because I do. I'm intentionally creating one just to illustrate a point. So action, comedy, and romance. Okay. One thing to ask in terms of the visibility. Okay. In all three of these cases, I need to set it to visible, right? In all three of those cases, I need to set it to visible. Okay. So I could put that line in all of these cases, but it would be kind of repetitive. So maybe on the same boat there. So rather than setting it in each case, I might just say at the top, well, it's just always visible. So I'm going to make it visible up here instead of making it visible on a case-by-case basis. Cool? All right, is everybody good with this so far? All right, let's go ahead and give it a try. That's not exactly the bug that I expected. Oh, I know. Yeah, that is the bug I expected. So notice right now that they're all showing up as Romans. Do you see that? Okay. So a little bit, it's been a while since we've used the switch statements. There's a really important thing you need to remember when we're using switch statements. Yes? Break. This is caused by not having breaks. Why is it caused by not having breaks? Well, the default behavior with switch statements is that it goes to whatever case and then keeps running. So if it's action, it's going to set it to the action icon, and then the comedy icon, and then the romance icon. If it's comedy, it's going to set it to the comedy icon, and then the romance icon. Or if it's the romance icon, it's just set to the romance icon. So by default, it falls through and runs the code in that case, and then all following cases. Okay, so you do have to be careful about that in terms of logic errors. So I need to go ahead and add a break for every single one of those. Okay, so I'm going to break after that's there. And go to try to run it again. Okay, so now we've got action, action, action. Is that a bug?
They were all action films, right?
They're all action films. So it's not actually a bug, right? They're all action films. It's actually kind of interesting though, in that one of the things I'm actually kind of surprised that neither of those got set to comedy or romance. I kind of actually would have still expected them to be. Because that would indicate to me that the last one it did every time was to do action. Another thing I want to mention here real quick, notice that we've got a break. Okay? That break breaks us out of the switch statement. Notice that the switch statement is also inside of a for loop. You see that? The switch statement is also inside of a for loop. Okay? You might remember that break also can break you out of a for loop. In this case, it's not doing that. Okay? Because break just breaks you out of the innermost thing. So it doesn't break me out of the for loop, it's just breaking me out of the switch. Okay? If I have the break at a different level, so let's say I'd broken up here outside of the switch, or after either here before or after the switch, that would break me out of the loop, because that would be the closest thing that it's breaking out. Does everybody see that? Java itself has a very interesting tool, syntax bit, because sometimes you do want to specify which thing are you breaking out of. Are you breaking out of the switch? You're breaking out of the for loop. So you can actually do something called a labeled break. Okay, so for instance, if I wanted to break out of the loop, I could apply a label to it. So a common thing I might do is I might say, here is entries, and here is entry or entry loop So I put a label at the beginning of the line with a colon, and here I might do, this is the, or maybe I'll call that for loop. Let's call that for loop. For loop, and switch. Oh, I need to call that a different thing. Switch key. Okay. So I've got labels, and basically this label labels this line, and this label labels that line. So I've got a label for the for statement, and I've got a label for the for loop, the switch statement for loop. Okay. So when I break, if I wanted to break out of the for loop, I would say break for loop. It would break out of both of those layers.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, if I wanted to do that. Or if I just want to be more specific and just say, hey, I only want to break out of the switch loop, the switch statement, I can say break switch key, and so I'm saying I'm just breaking out of that innermost layer. Okay. So you can be more explicit about which of those two things you want to break out of by using it.
How did you get it to add the label?
I just typed it in. I just typed in switch key colon.
It's got to be a non-taken, what do they call those?
Not a keyword.
Keyword.
Yeah, so like I couldn't use switch, I couldn't use for because those are both keywords. Those are both reserved words. So that is one thing you can do if you're trying to break out of different layers. I don't need that here because I'm only trying to break out of the one. I won't be breaking out of the others, but it is an option in Java. Last I know, C# doesn't have that. I really wish C# had that. I really wish JavaScript had that, but I don't believe that exists in either of those languages yet. Even though it's been in Java for a few years now. I want to do one more thing in here. So a common thing with switches is you may want to have some sort of default case. So by default, what icon does it show? So I might want to say, okay, well, if it's anything else, if it's maybe an icon that I'm not aware of, then I might use, say, like the error icon here and say, if I get another genre in the database that I don't know about, then I'll use the error icon. So let's say, just for illustration purposes, I'm going to go back to the database and add a new movie. And actually, I've got a test movie here, which I think isn't shown up because I don't have a release year. Release year 2022. And I also need a name, I think. So name is test, and I've got a genre map, and we're going to say test is the name of the genre, and it is true. So it's part of the test genre. So if I go back here, has it picked it up? Maybe, maybe not. Have I crashed the program? Okay, how am I filtering this data down? So looking at the view model, we were filtering this down. There's my order by. So order by release year and name. And that movie has both now. So it should appear. But I am not seeing it pop up in my app. So let's just see. If I go to the application, I wanted to go back to that. Movie list, app info, and maybe go ahead and just wipe the data on it. Clear storage. Okay, storage is cleared, so I'm not looking at local data. Okay, so there is an error occurring. So Google Play service is not available due to error 9. Could not reach Firestore backend. Backend did not respond within 10 seconds. Okay, so there is a problem with it reaching the backend. And you can kind of see here, it's saying internet connection. There's not a healthy internet connection right now, so it's just failing out. It could be that I'm on Wi-Fi. Let me try and go ahead and switch over to the wired network to see if that makes it come back. Give that a minute to transition. Yeah, so it's likely going to be the case that I need to wipe the data on the device and start over. That is likely the case. Okay, I'm on the wired network now to just see if that makes any difference. Okay, no difference. All right, so we're going to go to AVD Manager, and I'm going to clear the data on that device. So wipe data and start it back up. I think a few people have seen that error at this point now, and that's, as you can see, it happened to me. It happens every once in a while. So that's definitely a problem with the emulator side. Okay. Is it going to pop up? Give it a minute to start up the emulator. I'm getting a crash. Look at that. Let's see. Switch emulators. There's something. Okay. So it's crashing. Deserialize object. Failed to convert value of type string to integer found in release year. Oh. Okay. So when I set that up on the back end, I set the release year to a string and not an integer, not a number. There's my problem. So wiping the data and restarting helped somewhat because it was able to get back on the network, but there we go. Okay. So that test one, you can see now, is showing that error icon, right? Because I don't know I don't recognize that genre.
Which genre did you add to it? Something like action kind of.
Exactly. I just called it test. So in the database, I said genre test true, and that meant that we got this icon here instead. Okay. So do keep that in mind. Typically, when you're writing a switch statement, you always want to. It's always a good habit to add a default. Always add case 4. What if it's something I didn't anticipate? Right? What do I do if it's something I didn't plan for? And so that's what that default case is. Next question. You'll remember that some of these have more than one genre. Okay, so I'd like to show more than one icon in that case. Right now, I've hard-coded in the switch statement. You can see I've hard-coded 0 as the index. Does everybody see that? Okay. So what I need to do is kind of keep track of what image am I updating. As I'm going through the icons, I need to keep track of which icon am I updating. Okay. So I need another variable. I need a variable to track that. So up here, I might need to say int something and name it. So maybe I say icon index, and we're going to start that at 0. So rather than hard coding 0 in all of these cases, I'm going to use the icon index. Okay. I also need to ensure that that index gets updated so that we go to the next index. So I can do that more than one way. One way I could do that is I could try to iterate outside of the switch statement. So I could iterate before or after the switch statement. Okay. Just thinking about things, let's say I were to iterate up here. Okay, let's say I were to add one before we do the switching. Okay, what's the icon going to be the first time we get in here? What's the icon index going to be? Going to be 1. Because I'm taking 0, adding 1, and then setting 1. Okay, and I can test that real quick here. I just need to make sure that this loop is maybe not there for a minute because I'm going to have to come back and fix it. But you'll see that I'm setting that second icon, right? So if I start with the icon index as add 1 and then do the switch, you can see here it's the second icon, and here we've got the second and the third. Make sense? Okay. So I have that. So I could try to flip this over and say, okay, well, that's too early. I need to set it after the switch, right? I could look at that and say, okay, I'm iterating before I set the icon, so I need to do it after I set the icon. And that works, right? That works here. And now I'm getting 2 icons. Okay? Questions so far? Now, another thing here, another way to do this, this does presume, which is true, does presume that all of these different cases that I actually have set the icon. Okay? Which is true. But what if I have one of these cases where I don't set the icon? Well, then I would be iterating and going to the next icon even though I haven't set that one icon. You see that? So a common thing you'll see people do sometimes is put it directly in with the line. So let's say I put it in like so. Now, don't follow along with me right now. I'm gonna change this in a very second, so don't follow along with this moment. But in each of these statements, I'm going to say ++ icon. So I'm kind of saying iterate at the same time that you do that. Okay. Now remember that there's a pre-increment and there's a post-increment, right? If you put the plus plus before, it adds one and then does the thing. Okay, which is actually what's happening here, and you'll notice we have that same problem. So it's adds one and then sets one. Adds one, sets one, right? So I need to make sure that it actually adds one after, kind of like I needed to have it happen after the switch statement. So here's the part that you actually want to do. If I do index plus plus, that means it's happening after the line instead of before the line. So it says go set the icon, let's set it to this other thing, and then increment the index. Has the same effect as putting it after the switch statement. I'm just kind of embedding it in that same line. That's a preference thing, really. I go back and forth about putting plus plus in the middle of things. Some cases like this, it does create a nicer, cleaner syntax, and worse, but sometimes it's more cumbersome. Okay. So does that change make sense to everybody? Doing the plus plus within the index thing?
So this just means that it won't actually go to look at the next icon until it's actually set an icon.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So I say, okay, well, we'll do it at the same time we set one and advance it. Okay. Now, what about this part here? What about this loop? I'm going to bring this loop back in. So this loop here basically needs to pick up not at 1, but needs to pick up where the other thing let off. Does that make sense? So it needs to kind of resume and iterate everything after. So what I want to do here is in my initialization, I'm actually not going to have an initialization step because icon index is already at the right place. I'm going to loop that icon index until we get to the end of the list, adding one, adding one. So effectively what I do is I pick up where we left off and go through the remaining images using and clear that. Does that kind of make sense? Is it maybe a weird trick? Weird? Huh?
Can you explain how you just get rid of the first?
So when we're dealing with a for loop, just one thing to mention, all three of those parts are optional. It's actually legal to write a loop, like, let me show you here real quick. For that's legal in Java. Is I can say for semicolon semicolon.
Is that an infinite loop?
It is an infinite loop. Yes. It's got no initialization step. It's got new loop condition, and it's got no iteration step. But the middle part is the part that makes it an infinite loop. Because there's no condition in the middle, it just keeps looping forever. So if I put this one line into my program will just hang and never finish. But that is an infinite loop that we can write because those parts are optional. And so, yeah, you do get into some cases like this where I don't have any variables that I want to initialize because I've already done the initialization on previously. Okay. If I initialize it to 0, 1, whatever, it would be wrong because I really need to start it at whatever index it's already at. Okay. I also could have created another I, but that actually causes more problems. So I'm just using that same loop. That's the same counter for both of those loops. You're saying what, Evan?
It won't compile.
Mm-hmm. It won't compile?
It won't let you write anything.
Yeah, because it's smarter than it used to be.
Unreachable code.
But there actually are cases where I use that infinite loop It's just I use a break to get out of it, kind of thing. So that's my beginning sort of setup, and we can test this just to see that it works. So the first movie, I'm seeing a single action icon. Here we're seeing romance in action, comedy in action, and just the arrow icon because there's an invalid genre on that test movie. Cool? Questions? Okay. So, one gotcha. We fixed most of the issues here. What happens if I have a movie with 4 genres? Remember, I only set up 3 image views. Remember that? What happens if I have a movie with 4 genres? Yes?
So the 4 loop will work. If they don't work, by the time you do a switch, you'll have an array out of bounds exception.
Yeah, I'm going to have an array of bounds exception somewhere in here. Let me go ahead and add a test movie just so we can verify that, because it is going to make the application crash. So test for name, test for genres, release year. This time I need to remember to make it a number. 2022. Genre. This is a map, and I'm just going to say A, B, C, D. So this has got Boolean, 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 and save. So this document now has 4 genres, A, B, C, and D. Okay. They should all appear as icons. You can see the application's crashed when I return to it. Okay. So you'll notice when I run the application initially, it does not crash because that 4th movie is not on screen yet. It's not being bound. But when I scroll down is where it crashes, because at the point where that becomes visible, then it's like, oh, I have a problem here. Yes. So the problem, and I can look at Logcat, I can look here, I can see, okay, movie list, line 150. At some point, I'm trying to set an icon index that is past the end, right? And yeah, we've got an array index out of bounds exception here. So I need to check that I haven't set all the icons, right? Effectively, what I want to do is they say, okay, for that fourth genre, I don't really have a place to display it. I'm just going to not show it. Okay. Any thoughts to how I can fix this? How can I fix this so it doesn't crash? It just says at that 4th icon that we're going to be done here. How can I change this? Yes.
We write another condition on line 146 and say double and icon index is less than or equal to, or rather less than.
So 146, you're talking about this line here in the equals?
146, yes, that's right.
So
another condition inside that.
Okay. So you're saying your condition would be if the icon index is basically less than 3?
Less than 3, and 3 being that
3 being the length,
genre
right?
icon, something like this.
Yeah, and I would technically want to use the length, right? The gotcha there is that loop is still going, right? There's no point in keeping that loop going.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing there is that means it's checking every single iteration of the loop. I can be that would work, but I can be more efficient. Okay. So what I know, there's one thing I know. What are the places in this first loop where the icon index can change? Where are the places where the icon index can change? Only in that switch statement, right? Only in that switch statement. So the only time where it could have gone to 3 or higher is after that switch statement. So actually I can put the check right after that. So here, I know it's just been iterated, I know it's just been incremented. At that point would be the best place to put the check. So there I can say, okay, if the icon index is greater than or equal to the vh.genreIcons.length more than the number of icons we have, then we want to break out of the loop. So once we put an icon in, we just check if we set all the icons. If we set all the icons, we're done. Notice that this loop doesn't have to change, because if we're already at the end, then this loop doesn't go through any iterations, that second loop. See that? So if we're already at 3, this loop doesn't even apply. So simple if statement there. Problem solved. We don't get a crash when we go down here. We just see the first 3 icons. Okay, so the 4th icon is just lost, and I'm okay with that, right? I'm okay with saying we just throw away the 4th icon. Obviously, when you're building your application, you want to decide what is the upper limit of consoles or platforms that your games can be on, and set it that. It's probably going to be more than 3, right? Because there's at least 4 major platforms, right? So you're probably going to want at least space for 5 icons. Does that make sense? You're probably going to go ahead, and I would recommend reserving space for at least 5 icons in your UI. Okay? Questions? Make sense? So now I can see which one is there. I didn't do one thing that I kind of had meant to do, which was to show use that icons column from the genre collection. I've just kind of hard-coded things in right now, but I think I want to come back to that question. So, because part of my problem right now is I actually don't have that collection being pulled from the database, so I don't actually have access to that data yet. Okay, let's go ahead and take a quick break. We'll come back at 3. This part definitely took longer than I planned to, but let's come back at 3, and I'll talk about the next one.